Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. James Mulvenon, who is Director of Intelligence Integration for SOSi's Defense and Intelligence Group, where he has recruited and trained a team of more than 45 Chinese, Russian, Korean, and Farsi linguist-analysts and 10 cleared software developers performing collection analysis and operations support for U.S. government and corporate customers. A Chinese linguist by training, he is a leading international expert on Chinese cyber, technology transfer, espionage, and military issues. Dr. Mulvenon received his BA in Chinese Studies from the University of Michigan, studied Communist Party history at Fudan University in Shanghai, and received his Ph.D. in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Mulvenon contributed multiple chapters to China's Quest for Foreign Technology, Beyond Espionage, which was published in September of this year. He is regularly invited to address senior government and commercial audiences on Chinese technology espionage and cyber topics, and his comments have appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other international media outlets. James Mulvenon, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Oh, thank you, John. I'm happy to be here.
I would love to start this conversation and have you regale the audience on the creation myth around SOSi's organic information operations and linguist capabilities. It seems like there's probably a story there.
Well, there is. As you said in the bio, I'm a Chinese linguist by training, and I always start with that because it was so damn hard, and it took so long and destroyed my eyesight. But I've spent the last 25 years building teams of cleared linguist analysts supporting primarily U.S. government contracts. But there's always been this consistent theme in my own work and in the work that my organizations have done of really looking at this nexus between the information revolution and U.S. national security issues. And early on, we were advocates of exploiting the internet and digital information as a new sort of open source frontier. And then as those domains became militarized, beginning with patriotic hackers in the late 90s, and then through the cyber espionage from the Chinese and the aughts, and now, frankly, with the information operations battle that is being waged with the Russians and the Chinese. We're on the front lines of that. But from the other side, in terms of understanding the Chinese and Russian organizations that are involved, analyzing their tactics, techniques, and procedures, developing tools that allow us to track their narratives across traditional and social media. And so that's a major focus for our organization now.
Very good. This is maybe just a small little sidebar, but also relevant. How do people become linguists? I know in the military, there's the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, which is a big producer of military grade linguists. Could you talk a little bit about what the career path is for your typical linguist, or maybe there's different career paths depending on the language. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. There's basically two main sources in our business. And let me just say from the beginning that one of the problems we have because of the security clearance system, which has become more onerous, is that it aces you out on the contractor side of large numbers of naturalized citizens who have language fluency and cultural fluency because they simply can't get past the wickets with the security people, particularly if they're from denied area countries. In other words, the main high, NIPIF tier 1 countries that we care about, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, it's almost impossible to get them cleared. And we're doing classified intelligence contractor work. So that narrowly necks down your pool. And the other two sort of areas where you can recruit are, one, what you mentioned, which is the DLI graduates, the largely enlisted personnel who largely go into, Navy, Air Force, and Army, cryptologic careers working primarily for NSA, or the pool that I primarily draw from, which are students that attend universities like I did, Michigan, go blue, who enroll in China studies, study Chinese, and the majority of my linguist analysts. And by the way, I keep using that phrase, and I do that on purpose because I always want to communicate to my sponsors that we're not translators. Linguist-analyst is meant to connote that we exploit foreign language material in real time to answer analytic questions and do targeting, because translation, which is what SOS International largely does, is a much different discipline and requires completely different skill sets. So the average demographic of an linguist analyst on my staff is undergraduate studies in Chinese, at least a year to 2 years of immersion language training living abroad. For Chinese linguists, it's either Taiwan or China. And then almost all of them have a master's degree from a public policy school like Johns Hopkins SAIS or Georgetown or GW here in DC, studying area studies, where they're also getting the methodological tools that they need to be able to do the kind of analytics that we do. And that really is sort of my sweet spot. And there is a surprising number of people that fall into that category. I sort of to paraphrase Governor Romney, I have binders full of resumes of people that we would like to hire. And they are really the primary pool.
I'm going to lead the question here just a little bit, but there's my understanding is not all languages are equal. Some languages are easier to learn for Westerners than other languages. Could you talk just a little bit about that and how that might constrict your pipe in some languages too?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, in the military system, after you pass out the ASVAB and you have really high scores, which then opens up career tracks like intelligence and cryptolinguist, they then give you a diagnostic test to see which languages would be more appropriate for you. And the very highest scores are required for Chinese and Arabic. And I can talk in a minute why, because I think that, other Romance languages like Spanish or German or things like that, or Italian, and certainly languages that use the Latin alphabet are generally easier for people to pick up. Now, my personal bias, and I will admit, I'll admit my analytic assumptions and biases, is that Chinese is the hardest. And just let me briefly explain why. There is very little relationship between the written Chinese characters and the way that they sound. I mean, you can guess, there's some clues, but it's not like looking at an English word when you're a small child and seeing, a diphthong like TH and knowing that every time you see that, it's going to be pronounced, and so what I could teach you, John, to read Chinese relatively fluently, you could read newspapers, and you'd have almost no idea how to speak or comprehend someone speaking to you. I could also teach you using like Pimsleur, which is far and away the best language sort of method out there. I could teach you to speak and listen to Chinese and you would have absolutely no clue as to how to write or read it. And then compounding that is really for, high school level fluency, you really need to understand about 7 to 8,000 distinct Chinese characters and a couple of dozen thousand combinations of those characters into words. And so you learn this speaking and listening language, and then you learn this written language, and then you have to cognitively weave the two together in your mind to form a single language. So that's really why I think Chinese is the most challenging language that I've ever run across. And when I talk to people at NSA's internal think tank on language, they're all NSA cleared PhDs in cognitive linguistics. They agree with that assessment.
That is astonishing. Thanks for that recap. It boggles the mind just to hear you describe the way the Chinese language is assembled in the brain. All right, so why don't we get into China? So I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about your ongoing efforts, your historical efforts relative to Chinese disinformation and the types of operations that they are levying against the world and the West. And then we can do the same thing on the Russian side and then look at doing a comparison and contrast of the two countries. Could you start with China, please?
Sure. So obviously China is my main focus, and SOS International has a very robust effort underway on Chinese information operations and computer network operations from a cyber threat intelligence perspective. We have 37 cleared Chinese linguist-analysts at SOSi in my crew, which is probably the largest crew outside of NSA. Certainly the largest crew within the contractor space. So it's really a center of excellence for us. And the Chinese are definitely active in this area. Long ago, they developed this notion of what they call the three warfares, which, public opinion warfare and psychological warfare and media warfare. And this really has a lot to do with their approach to foreign perception management. But they've also been good students of what has happened with the Russians and the Russian gray and hybrid warfare. And later we'll talk about sort of similarities and differences. But one recent study that we did called Metropolis Festival looked specifically at the January 2020 Taiwan presidential election. And we had a very aggressive collection operation against what was going on, what the Chinese were doing to try and influence the outcome of that election, principally focused on two Chinese organizations. The Chinese military's 311 base, also known as the Voice of the Strait, as well as the United Front Work Department under the Communist Party and some of the activities they were involved in. Now, what was really interesting was obviously the incumbent presidential candidate, Tsai Ing-wen, was opposed by Beijing because her Democratic Progressive Party has historically been associated with Taiwan independence activities, and obviously Beijing is firmly opposed to that. But her opponent in the KMT, in the Kuomintang, was also perceived by Beijing as being very pro-Beijing and Beijing friendly. So what we were looking at was a variety of narratives, and we were aided in the fact that the primary social media platform in Taiwan is Facebook. And so it was a platform that we were very familiar with, although from a tradecraft perspective, there were real limitations because of terms of use and things like that involving Facebook. But we were monitoring a variety of Tsai Ing-wen groups on the Facebook, as well as the groups that were populated by her opponent in the KMT, and looking for in the pro DPP Facebook groups looking for individuals that were propagating narratives or memes meant to defame her or to reduce her support. And then also in the other one, looking for clear amplification and aggressive pushing of memes and narratives meant to support her opponent. Now, one interesting side note is, and this is really important for information operations, I think, is understanding the collection terrain. There was a specific technology in Taiwan called PTT, which was a telnet based. I mean, what a throwback for to like the 70s and 80s. There was a telnet based board called PTT that had a channel called #HatePolitics that was actually very popular on Taiwan, and a primary fora in which Taiwanese were discussing politics. And so we had to design collection tools that would also allow us to collect against that non-traditional platform. And what we discovered was that the Chinese military in particular were very aggressive in these fora, trying to push these memes. But then they ultimately failed. She won easily. She won re-election very easily. But the main thing that we were looking for was we were also trying to understand whether there were any harbingers of what we might see later in 2020 in the US presidential election, that we might look as, indications and warning signatures of Chinese activity that would happen later. And what we discovered also was that the Chinese were beginning to experiment with a lot of deep fake software. And so in our lab, we downloaded all of the Chinese deep fake software applications and reverse engineered them and tried to develop, along with people we were working with at DARPA, tried to develop some signatures of videos that had been used creating that software, the idea being that we would again see them in the November 2020 presidential election. And we have continued that China work to this day, but very focused on their COVID-19 narratives, in particular, the information operations that we're tracking where Chinese groups appear to be trying to reduce the US population's confidence in the efficacy of an eventual vaccine, which of course is extremely relevant right now. And we're working closely with the State Global Engagement Center and the Counterinfluence Task Force at FBI and other groups to try and help the US government understand these sort of anti-vaxxer memes and the Chinese role in amplifying those anti-vaxxer memes to try and reduce the number of people in the United States who agree to take the vaccine, which would then extend the time period of the pandemic and make it take longer for us to achieve herd immunity.
Wow, a lot to go into there potentially. So you mentioned that Chinese information operators are active within Facebook in Taiwan, for example, and this Telnet board. So are bots part of the Chinese, go-to influence campaigns, or is that something that you see less of in the Chinese operations?
No, they're very active when they're, and some of the software we've developed, like Exovera Narratives, which allows us to track narratives across traditional media and then track whether those are being amplified or suppressed across corresponding social media, which is our primary measures of effectiveness and sort of battle damage assessment tool that we use both for foreign information operations as well as the support we're providing to people in the sort of J39 SOCOM world as well, which I think is a unique capability. Measures of effectiveness really becomes the coin of the realm, right? It's not, we broadcast, X number of hours of commando solo and we dropped X number of thousands of leaflets. One of the main weaknesses right now in the IO sort of field is exactly that sort of feedback loop of measures of effectiveness. And one of the key sub-indicators that we care about is whether, in fact, that amplification is being done organically by humans or whether it's being done by machines. And so within Exovera Narratives, we've developed some machine learning algorithms that allow us to analyze the propagation in a way that shows whether it's being automated or whether it's being done by humans, and that's been very helpful. The Chinese do use bots and troll farms and things along those lines. And once you strip those away, we then use that to get back to the original patient zeros, which are the original smaller group of IO actors, and that then allows us to, it helps us do sort of attribution analysis of who they are and where they're coming from.
You mentioned one of the reasons, I'm sure there are many, one of the reasons to study the election in Taiwan earlier in 2020 is to try to parlay those learnings into providing some leading indicators for our election that we just had. Did those efforts bear fruit? Did you actually observe some similar behaviors in our elections that you also observed in the Taiwanese election?
A little bit, but not as much as we expected. Again, the Chinese, and this, just to give you a bit of a preview about the comparison contrast, the Chinese IO are very focused in two main areas, and this is very different from the Russians. Chinese IO is focused on correcting and refuting narratives about China that Beijing thinks are derogatory. So, the Chinese IO around COVID is very focused on refuting the idea that there was a cover-up in Wuhan, that China is somehow responsible for the global pandemic. And on the other side of that, the Chinese IO is very focused on propagating a positive narrative. And this is true, that the other side of Chinese IO is to put China in as best a possible light as it possibly can, and project China's positive themes. And the positive theme in the COVID context is to emphasize how successful China was in suppressing the pandemic, how generous they've been with foreign countries in terms of providing assistance, how open they have been in their own mind about sharing information related to COVID-19, and really presenting themselves as a force for good in global public health, and rather than as sort of the ground zero of the pandemic that has taken millions of lives around the globe.
Yeah, interesting. This is another little sidebar on China. I read recently about the phenomenon of the Chinese Diaspora and how the Chinese government is, I guess, making overt or maybe not so subtle communications to the world population that is of Chinese descent, that someday in the future, the expectation is that if you have Chinese lineage, then the expectation is that you are going to be loyal to China in the long run. Is that an accurate capture of that dynamic, or could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, and this is really important, John, because this is now becoming a major source of tension in the Western world and within Western societies. And I think there's some important points to be made here. One is, on the Chinese side, there is a very dedicated effort, primarily through the Communist Party's United Front Work Department, by the way, whose slogan is, to use our true friends to attack our true enemies. That's their slogan.
Wow.
Through the use of organizations around the world to be able to connect to this diaspora, to be able to maintain those connections to China, to be able to manipulate and leverage those organizations in order to further China's interests. And there are many people in these societies of Chinese lineage who actively participate in these groups, who take resources and gifts and trips back to China from these organizations, and actively, either wittingly or unwittingly, and that's the key issue here, either wittingly or unwittingly propagate these information operations messages in their home countries. And Beijing, for its part, has a very, very distinct view about extraterritoriality. In other words, they do view the diaspora abroad as part of a greater China that has obligations to the motherland, and they play upon those feelings. Now, the dark side of that is if Western governments do not subtly respond to that, it has very quickly devolved in some cases into a McCarthyist sort of witch hunt,
right,
against people of Chinese descent, many of whom are loyal Americans and loyal Australians. And so part of the problem has been the sort of crude reaction to these very real dynamics, which in essence are causing they're sort of causing the very negative phenomena that we're actually trying to avoid. And I do spend a lot of time with the FBI and other people, almost conducting sort of Emily Post style etiquette classes about how to approach these issues. But at the end of the day, it's important to note that while we need to be more sensitive to these concerns and to be able to winnow, separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of, who is actively acting as a witting agent on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party and who is not, ultimately the blame lays at Beijing's feet, because we wouldn't have these concerns if they weren't explicitly targeting people of Chinese ethnicity for these activities. And it's increasingly clear that they do not respect dual nationality, whether it is their efforts. There's this poor kid at Georgetown whose father is a fugitive from the PRC for legal reasons, largely politically motivated. The kid was born in the United States, is a U.S. citizen, has a U.S. passport, flew back to China on his U.S. passport, went through Chinese customs with his U.S. passport, and now the Chinese government has held him and his sister for over 2 years on a so-called exit ban, which is sort of an illegal detention. But it's because they don't recognize his U.S. citizenship and his U.S. passport. They recognize the fact that his parents are PRC nationals, and therefore they're treating him as a PRC national. And that, I could give you a dozen other examples where the Chinese have that view of the diaspora that runs counter to international laws and the Vienna Convention and a whole bunch of other stuff. But I think that's kind of a microcosm of their view as well, of why these diasporas, in their view, have a dual loyalty that could potentially be leveraged and exploited. And it's led to some very ugly dynamics in Australia and in the United States, that on the one hand, obviously I write a lot about Chinese espionage and Chinese IO, so I'm very keen about the threat, but I'm spend just as much time trying to emphasize the subtle dynamics so that it doesn't devolve into ugly race baiting and sort of yellow parallelism that I think would be counterproductive, would confirm or verify or deepen Beijing's own strategies. In other words, it's completely counterproductive to our eventual goal of maintaining U.S. national security.
Yeah, it's so complicated, so sensitive, so easy to go into those McCarthy-esque type of places, as you were mentioning, and these examples of China not treating individuals properly and not respecting international norms goes right into the focus of effort, as you were describing, for China, as putting forth narratives and themes that help correct or refute these activities, so that China's standing on the world stage is as positive as possible, presumably. Mm-hmm. So that's China, and I know that we could continue to drill down on all kinds of other examples, but why don't we transition over to Russia, and would love to get some of your recent activities on the Russian front and analyzing their activities in support of national security.
Sure. So while, as a Chinese linguist, I'm blessed with a large number of Chinese linguists, but I also have a fabulous cleared Russian linguist analyst team of a half dozen subject matter experts in this area, including a couple of individuals who have done a lot of field work in the Ukraine, have a great affinity with the Bellingcat crew and some of the other people that have really been path breakers in this area. And using that Exovera narratives tool that I mentioned earlier, we have been working for the last couple of years for the State Global Engagement Center, looking at Russian information operations in the Baltics, so in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, as well as Belarus and Moldova, looking for that cyber front end that we saw in Estonia in 2007, in Georgia in 2008, obviously in the Ukraine and Crimea in 2014, the US election in 2016, and then, but specifically focused on the near abroad, in these sort of disputed areas, South Ossetia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Transdniester, places like that, where we know that the past Russian pattern is to have that cyber front end, deniable information operations, largely in Russian language media and social media. And then behind that comes the little green men and the irregular forces that then change the sovereignty reality on the ground. Seeing in particular the play of this in the Baltics, where there is a correct Russian perception that NATO is much more focused on preventing another sort of Anschluss type takeover in the Baltics. Although, if you've ever spent any time with Estonians who are of Finnish descent, I'm not sure the Russians want to bite that off, because those are some hard people. that is not a fight that I would want. But in order, and SOCIR in particular is very focused on cross training with their Baltic counterparts to prevent exactly those kinds of irredentist takeovers in those areas. And so we've had lots of really interesting discussions with SOCIR about this and with state, trying to identify these dynamics. Who are the key organizations on the Russian side? What are the key themes? And the Russians are extremely active in these areas, and showing the level of sophistication, frankly, that we really saw in the 06 period, the 16 period with respect to the US election. Playing left against right, right against left, really degrading and disrupting the legitimacy of political institutions, and then again, so that's really that interesting contrast. So on the one hand, the Chinese are very focused twofold on presenting China in the best possible light and refuting criticism of China. The Russians, not surprisingly, if you read Dostoevsky, tend to be more nihilist. They tend to, they just want to disrupt and cause chaos. And again, they don't care whether they're amplifying Bernie Bro messages or Proud Boy messages, whatever they can do to sort of destabilize and disrupt societies and delegitimize institutions furthers their goal of weakening potential adversaries.
Wow, again, a lot to unpack. I'm struck, the notion of sovereignty has come up a couple of times, and you described Russia using information operations to advance and take new territory, for example, in the Ukraine, and for China. I have a little touch point with sovereignty talking about the Chinese diaspora. So those are two very different notions of sovereignty in the information operations space. What does the academic literature say about sovereignty and information operations?
Well, I mean, both China and Russia share a deep neuralgia about territory. In the Russian case, the near abroad, the countries I mentioned, are viewed as part of elements of the traditional Russian Empire, but also by Putin and his cronies as part of the former Soviet Empire, and therefore, at a minimum, falling under their sphere of influence, and at a maximum, falling under their territory that they should directly control. And of course, the primary neuralgia on the Russian side is NATO expansion,
Right.
which they believe was too aggressive and too far-reaching and did not respect their national interests. And instead, so they consider these near abroad countries as buffer states, if you will, against further encroachment by NATO. On the Chinese side, obviously, you have a deep neuralgia about Western imperialism in the 19th century, the unequal treaties, the stealing of Hong Kong and Macau and Taiwan, and all of the disputes it has on the Indian border and in Russian Far East and other places. So again, a deep set of insecurities about their periphery and the solidity of their periphery. I think in the Chinese case, this is one of the explanations for why, as some people like to laugh, China is more Westphalian than Westphalia. I mean, China is more focused on sovereignty than most Western countries are focused on sovereignty, where the idea was created. And this is particularly true in the digital realm, where China is really the counterpole to the Western notion of internet freedom and the idea that while countries exist, that there is this sort of digital metaverse, as William Gibson would have called it, where that transcends sovereignty, where we can live online either as avatars or in true name, and that this is somehow, as John Perry Barlow called it, governments of the world, you have no jurisdiction or sovereignty here. This is this new realm, if you will. The Chinese think that that's complete BS. And they've been the ones pushing with the Russians this idea of realigning digital sovereignty with national sovereignty. And that has led to this phenomena of the splinter net, where national governments increasingly are erecting walls to the free flow of packets and digital data, and saying, we not only have the right to protect the networks within our country, but we also have the right to police the content on those networks. And that's a fundamental countergrain. It's a huge philosophical battle between the United States and a couple of like-minded countries and China. And, and the Europeans are not really allied with us in that area because they have these very different notions of hate speech. So they are very much also part of the true name registration revolution. And the United States is very alone in this area, and so that's a real fault line. And a lot of these notions of physical sovereignty are playing out in this philosophical battle about digital sovereignty.
That is fascinating. I got into this a little bit on another discussion with a gentleman named Tom Sear from Australia, and he is a cyber expert, and we talked a little bit about digital sovereignty. And I brought up the point, or he made the point that China, at least, is developing what he calls data stacks, and the data stack, and walling off Chinese information from the rest of the world. And I made a comment that there's a bit of a historical echo, possibly with China, turning away from the world exploration. I think it was in the 1400s, and turning inward, and how that decision at the time had long-term ramifications that didn't work out too well in China's favor, for not having the influx of culture and helping to engage China with the world. And this same kind of a dynamic is happening relative to information and information sharing and walling off information, and how that's at odds with the notion of the democratization of information, free flow of information, and how that's better for the world than walling off information. Do you have any thoughts on?
Oh yeah, no, I actually think about this a lot. And that insularity after the 14th century is viewed by many people as one of the reasons why China didn't have an industrial revolution, which then made them vulnerable to Western imperialism, and the sort of metal ships against wooden ships problem.
Right.
And so China, of course, is a mass of contradictions, because they are right now simultaneously pulling inward and becoming more insular, in terms of data localization. And, even Xi Jinping recently promulgated this notion of what he called the dual circulation strategy, which was, it's kind of a defensive reaction to the fact that after 15 to 20 years of the so-called go out strategy, where China tried to develop relationships around the world and strategic partnerships and free trade agreements, there was this massive backlash against China that we now see with the Trump trade policies and the tariffs, and the effort to now decouple industries and supply chains out of China. So China has, under Xi Jinping, has sort of begun to retreat a little bit back into more of an autarkic kind of mindset that says we need to be self-sufficient. We can't be dependent on foreign technology. We need to protect our own technology interests. And we need to recognize that we have these massive internal markets. And so while it is still important for us to have interaction with the outside world, we really need to focus more on our own knitting, and really protect ourselves. So there is this sense of China going back into a little bit more of a strategic fetal position on that, and which of course creates all kinds of negative phenomena that I'm tracking, like, decoupling naturally leads to an even greater emphasis on the Chinese side on cyber and technology espionage, right? Because now multinationals are decoupling and they're leaving China, but China still needs those technologies. So how are they going to get them? Well, they need to ramp up even more technology and cyber espionage. But it's not all bad news, John. As I like to point out to people, the post-Snowden global phenomena of data localization activities, while it may be bad for Google and Amazon and other people who now have to build, Hungarian data centers in Hungary to store Hungarian data under GDPR. It also, in my view, heralds a potential golden age of SIGINT, because now when we know, when we're in that Hungarian data center, that all the data in that data center is Hungarian data and not US person data. And so all of our executive order 12333 concerns and our US person minimization concerns go right out the window. So I'm trying to, turn a frown upside down into a smile and trying to understand how some of these phenomena, at least for some of my comrades in the intelligence enterprise, aren't sort of absolute negatives.
It's real easy for people who are less versed in these operations than you are to naturally start thinking, well, Russia and China, they share a border, they have a seemingly mutual interest in targeting the West or the United States on the information front and below the level of armed conflict. So could you talk a little bit about the growing belief that Russia and China are overtly or covertly collaborating in the information environment?
Well, so first, let's just talk about learning. We actually did a study for Indo-PACOM in which we mined Chinese military internal writings on what lessons they've learned from Russian gray and hybrid warfare activities in the near abroad, and what are the implications that they drew for their own conflicts on their own periphery. And one of their insights was that the Russians appear to have found a unique vulnerability or Achilles heel of the so-called American way of war that prevented us from reversing the annexation of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. And that was exactly to stay irregular and non-kinetic, and therefore our potential options of reaction would then be seen as escalatory, right? And the Chinese have taken that and then mapped it into their own domains, looking at scenarios in South China Sea, East China Sea, and Taiwan. And just let me play out a South China Sea scenario that they discussed. Okay, so you have these reefs and shoals in the South China Sea that are disputed. Scarborough Shoal, for instance, which is under international law, in my view, belongs to the Philippines, but the Philippine Navy is not exactly very robust. And so the Chinese have engaged in some longstanding activities to prevent Philippine fishermen from being able to fish the shoal and things along those lines. So the way the Chinese spin out the implications of the Russian hybrid warfare is the subtitle of our report was From Little Green Men to Little White and Blue Boats. And what we meant by little white and blue boats was, in case of white boats, is the Chinese Coast Guard, who are, this isn't quite the Coast Guard that we think of. These are huge ships. They're unarmed, but they're very large and they have a lot of them. And the little blue boats are the maritime militia forces, and also unarmed, that can swarm around one of these situations. And so using these white and blue boats, the Chinese surround Scarborough Shoal while simultaneously carrying out plausibly deniable cyber operations against Philippine critical infrastructure, much as we saw the Russians using black ice against the Ukrainian power grid, such that the combination of those two things causes Duterte and other people in the Philippines to effectively cede the sovereignty of Scarborough Shoal to the Chinese because of all these non-kinetic activities. Now, US Navy is on station, but our only escalatory option is to roll in with gray hulls, armed gray hulls. And so we then look like we're escalating the situation to the kinetic level. And therefore, China can use that dynamic in its information operations to talk about U.S. belligerence and U.S. militarism and contrast it with their own sort of subkinetic activities. And so there's a really good example of learning by the Chinese side from what they learned from the Russian side. Now, in terms of direct cooperation, I have no doubt at this point that there is intelligence sharing between the two sides. And then maybe at an even more complex level, on the attribution side, in the last couple of years, the real challenge in the cyber threat intelligence arena is state actors, because of the successes that had been achieved over the last 10 or 15 years in terms of naming and shaming and attribution, now adopting a masquerade or impersonation strategy where they are using the KIT and the TTPs of other advanced persistent threat groups in order to impersonate those groups in order to complicate and obfuscate attribution. And so I think one of the major challenges right now is when we see, for instance, just the other day, the activity that has been attributed to APT-29, which is Russian SVR, against US government and other corporate networks using the compromise of the SolarWinds network management portal. My first caution to people, in addition to the usual, early intel reports are almost always wrong, is to understand that, what people stole from FireEye were not just red team tools, but they stole entire modules that would allow foreign state actors to impersonate the APT groups of other countries in a very effective way. And so playing our sort of signature analysis against us. So, these are complex times, John. And so, it really requires us to dramatically up our game in terms of digging out the attribution of these activities.
Well, that is a astonishing recap of the dynamics that are going on and how Russia and China are learning from one another, likely sharing intelligence, et cetera. I'd like to wrap things up with you, James, and see if you could please make a recommendation to our audience of a book that touches on some of the themes that we've been discussing. And if they want to learn a little bit more, they can check it out.
No problem. Well, I have to first ask you, John, whether this podcast is G-rated or whether I can use a swear word, because it's kind of necessary for describing the book.
I think in this circumstance, it's swearing is authorized.
Okay. So I would just recommend to your listeners the Cambridge Analytica book, Mindfuck, by Chris Wiley. And the reason I recommend that book, even though we've been talking about China and Russia the whole time, is because it was really eye-opening to me. Some of the analysis, academic, behavioral, psychological analysis that underlay Cambridge Analytica's strategies in 2015 and 2016 that allowed them to have such a disproportionate effect on the US election. And just to understand that it's these same dynamics that are described in that book that are being exploited by the Russians and Chinese in their IO in the West. Now I will say that I'm just as concerned about Western surveillance capitalism as I am about Chinese and Russian IO. So I sort of view them as two sides of the same coin. And so, I think it's just as important to read Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism as it is to read Mindfuck. But I think if you read those two books together in concert, you'd have a pretty good understanding of the major strategic dilemmas that we now face in the information space.
Outstanding. That is the second time that Mindfuck has been recommended. And as always, we will have links to these materials in the show notes for listeners to go check out. And with that, Dr. James Mulvenon, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
No, it's my pleasure, John. And thank you very much for inviting me.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.